So Barbara, with all of the things that you do, because you do gardening, but you do so much more. There's a lot of other things that you've done here, but one of the most monumental tasks that you have taken on recently is to do a complete and thorough history of Hunt community. That was very important to you,
Yes.
and you went through it with a fine-tooth comb.
It was a very small comb because there isn't that much reference material out there.
I know, and yet you came up with, we're publishing a series of articles that you have written as a result of your, subsequent to your research, and we've got a series of 10.
Yeah.
We've got 10 articles. So with the scant resources, you managed to really come up with a lot of information, and fascinating information.
It's fascinating, and I hope it's right because you,
I hope it's right too, because I'm
you get a
publishing it.
reference from one person, and 20 years later, the next person decides to do it, and it doesn't quite mesh, but
Doesn't quite line up.
right.
But
But we
close
won't
enough.
tell. We won't
But
tell the
yeah,
audience.
we won't tell anybody
No.
about that. That'll be our
No,
secret.
I chose the best.
So how old is Hunt Community?
Hunt Community was started by Mrs. Hunt when she wrote her will in something like 1894. And in her will, she left $85,000 to establish a home for indigent men. And she spelled it out very, very carefully. And she said they had to be citizens of the United States, residents of Nashua. They had to be Protestant. And some references said there is no entrance fee. Others say everybody who came gave $100. Where if they were indigent, they got $100. I have
Especially
no idea.
back
But
then.
that's the problem
Yeah.
I had going from reference to reference.
And what prompted this, and the things I've been able to read too, including your research, is Civil War veterans. There were Civil War veterans that were injured and through whatever life experiences weren't able to adequately care for themselves.
Well, the daughter, Elizabeth Mary, had spent her time as a community project working with homeless people. And she concentrated on the retired soldiers from the war. But then she decided that she would leave that to other people and go on. And that's when she and her mother decided that they would build the John Hunt building as a memorial to husband and father. And that was very interesting because, as far as I can tell, it was the first all-inclusive home for people. When someone applied to come here, they gave all their worldly possessions to the Hunt, and the Hunt said, "We will take care of you until you die." And so they had room for I don't know, something like, if I'm looking at the page, maybe 15 people. There were 15 apartments, and those people moved in, and the Hunt provided food, clothing, everything to furnish their apartment. They gave them spending money. And I thought that was such an insight into them that the Hunt's mother and daughter would realize that people who have no money are helpless.
Because this is before Social Security.
This is before.
There's no-
And they have given everything away.
Yes.
They have given everything into the hunt.
Yeah, so they have no income.
They-
So they received personal spending money.
Every month. Every
Every
month
month.
they got their spending money. And while they were living here, if the men were in the living room smoking and ran out of tobacco, they went to the front desk, and the front desk had tobacco. And if somebody wanted some candy, there was candy around. And I mean, they did everything. They provided their clothes, they transportation to go to church, and they took care of those people right to death. And in the Pinewood Cemetery up by St. Joseph's Hospital are two monuments, and one is a monument to the people in the John building who died, the men and their wives, and the other one is people in the Mary building, which was built later, and that's all the women, and all their names are up there, and their footstones are in both places. And Mr. and Mrs. Hunt and their daughter are buried behind the Unitarian Church on the other side of town, and their monument is still there.
So the daughter, Mary Elizabeth, because wasn't the Hunt community constantly filled, and there was a waiting list?
Oh, yeah.
And so Mary Elizabeth, the daughter, then had the Mary building for women in honor of her mother. So
Which came along later.
Later. So
Yeah.
the John building, and of course, was for men, and then she added the Mary building, which was for women,
Dedicated to her mother, right?
dedicated to her mother.
And she remained on the board of directors of the Hunt community for her whole life.
She, from all of the reading, was an extraordinary businesswoman.
She was incredible, as a matter of fact, for the time and everything. John was very successful, a very successful businessman. He started by inheriting his father's tavern, and he grew that, and then he became postmaster, and then the bank hired him to be cashier. Now, there's no definition of cashier here, but he was there for 30 years, and consequently, it was just he and the president of the bank, I think his name was Shattuck, and so he knew all the business in town and everything that was going on and what was proposed here and there. And so he invested in the railroad coming in, he invested in the mills, he invested every time there was something. And so he built his fortune, and when he died, he had $223,000 or less, because his wife said she didn't want his assets published for anybody to read, but they assumed it was less than $123,000. He didn't have a will, and I don't know why, because he was a very smart man, but because he didn't have a will, a third of that money went to his wife and the rest went to his daughter. And so you take a third of 123 and the rest, and so that's what the daughter inherited. By the time she died, she had $1,230,000 and was the richest woman in New Hampshire, plus or minus. And it wasn't as if her father was helping her, or
No, yeah.
she was a very, very smart cookie. And she never married because she said she never knew if men were interested in her or her money.
Yes.
And so she remained a single woman for her whole life.
And she was very frugal.
The whole family was very frugal.
Yes. So they didn't squander any of that. They didn't have servants even though they could afford them. They
No, she's-
didn't do anything extravagant even though they could have afforded extravagance. They did not do that. They lived a simple life.
They lived a simple life in the same house that they built, their original house. And because I have no idea how houses were numbered on Main Street in Nashua, but I assume when they bought the 19 acres that we are living on today, that a corner of that on Main Street and Ald Street was where John and Israel built a duplex house, and they
Israel
both lived
is
there.
the brother.
They moved, that's John's brother.
Yeah.
They moved the post office in the house.
Yeah.
They started a loan company in the house and everything. And sooner or later, John bought out Israel, and he and Mary lived there for the rest of their lives. They didn't go into mansions that everybody else was doing. Mary said, sure, I could afford 10 servants. I don't need them. Yeah. And that's the way they lived. And consequently, if I lived that way, I'd have $1,230,000 now too.
But I just love that they were not pretentious. Their goals, their desires, their ambitions were genuinely to help others.
Yes, and that's I think that spirit has stayed with us because living here, having been here for 10 years now, but we do have a caring community here. Everybody, anytime you need help with anything, there is always someone ready to step up and help you. If you're not feeling well, somebody will check in. They'll bring you dinner, and that spirit of the Hunts has stayed here the whole time. And when I hear from other group communities like this, they have cliques and people don't get along and all this is going on. We are so
Yes,
lucky.
I hear that a lot. I hear that
Yeah,
a lot.
absolutely.
The original inmates.
Inmates.
They called
absolutely.
them inmates, right?
Absolutely.
They were called inmates. The original inmates, regardless of their status in life, were treated with dignity. And that is
The allowance says it all. As far as I'm concerned,
Yes.
it's that allowance that says it all about them.
Yes, they were respected, treated with dignity, and they were happy with where they were living. And it is astonishing to me that 120 some years later, the original intention still exists.
Right.
It is still the driving force of what Hunt community is about.
Well, when the first people moved in, everybody helped. If you had a skill, you used it because they had the 19 acres and it was an active farm, and they had pigs and cows and chickens and a great big garden, and any inmate who had any farming skills did that. The flower people
Gardeners were there.
were there.
Back then, originally.
The
We still have
knitters,
gardeners.
the knitters in the living
yes.
room were knitting away, and anytime there was anything left over, they had too many tomatoes, too many peas, whatever. The excess was donated to one of the homes for indigent people around Nashua, and they said that they would never take any money for that because
Right.
they were not in the business of making money.
Correct. We also should say, in the original Hunt home, it included a library. However, and we still obviously we're in the library today, Mary Elizabeth is responsible for the library up on the top of Main Street.
and mother.
And mother.
And mother. They gave, I don't know,
$50,000?
$50,000, and they donated it to the town to build a public library. Now the problem with the town is we had the mill owners and the mill workers. And at one point, the mill owners decided they didn't want to associate with the workers, and so they all moved north of the river, and they
Yes.
built beautiful homes, which are still up there now on the way to Greeley Park. And they set up their own town, which lasted 10 years when they suddenly discovered they had to pay for the police, the fire department, the roads, the trash, the everything. And then they said, well, maybe it's not so much. But anyway, they looked all over for a site for the library and decided that you cross the river going north on Main Street and up the hill on the right. There was the right spot for it. And the town government niggled and fought and rearranged and just went on and on and on. And Mary, mother and daughter, got so fed up with them that they asked the town to give them their money back. We're not going to be in this anymore. And just as soon as they said, we want our money back, suddenly everybody agreed.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, this is a good spot. This will be wonderful. And that building, if you have never been in it, is just beautiful.
Yes,
And they
it is.
refurbished it a few years ago, and they're going to do something else right now to it as well. And so they did that. And then after, and that opened in 1910, and the the foundation for the John Building, and in memory of our dad, had that thought was already in progress. And so while the town was fighting about this, they were just coming along and planning this part of their project. And it was all, there's one article, and it describes the daughter as frumpy and grumpy, and people didn't want to work with her, and they just went on and on. But, oh my God, the wonderful things she did.
Yes.
And the interesting thing about it was she was such a generous person that anybody who needed money, she gave them money because she had it. And but then she got so sick of people knocking on the door and asking her for money. She moved to the Parker House in Boston.
Yeah.
And she lived the last 10 years of her life there. She came back for the regular monthly meetings of governing this complex, but she lived there. And if she had company, and they stayed for dinner, she would order very frugally, and she would take her leftovers home. And I can remember my Auntie Anna being so uncomfortable asking to take home something from a restaurant we were in, and this was 50 years before she was in the Parker House. But she took her leftovers home. But she always said to the people who she invited, "Oh, have more, have some dessert, have some wine, whatever." But she was a very, very frugal to her last breath.
It's very unfortunate the way she was painted, because clearly in her deeds, the things that she did, she was obviously an incredibly generous woman who was inundated with people looking for things
Everybody.
that she had to actually leave her own home. But in one of the articles that you supplied, she was referred to, when she moved, as a stingy spinster.
Absolutely.
A stingy spinster. This woman who has supplied, I mean, it's so unfortunate. But, you know, how brave of her to stand her ground, being a woman at that time. And still
Absolutely.
standing her ground and making the demands and not buckling to the expectations of the society. They were visionaries.
Yeah.
They were absolute visionaries. And I love the fact that we have never stepped outside of that vision. This history of Hmong community was really important to do. You vetted out the truth, the reality of it, and it is more fascinating than any of the...
Absolutely. Extraordinary.
Extraordinary.
Those women
Yes.
were
That is extraordinary. Yes.
Yes.
And I'm glad we're doing this in March because you know March is
My birthday. Oh, no. March is what?
Women's History Month.
Women's History.
Yes.
Yeah.
Women's History Month. And I think that the Hunt women...
The Hunt women are
yes,
at the
they
top of the
should be-
list.
They're at the top of the list.
Top of the list.
Barbara, thank you very
Thank you for
much
inviting me.
for
It's
coming
good.
and spending time with us and telling us this.
I love spending time with you.
Oh, I love spending time with you too. Thank you, Barbara.
Thank